Hi, welcome back to Rock Talk with Dr. Cropper. On today's episode, we are going to discuss Led Zeppelin's 1977 tour of the United States. This ended up being their last time through America, actually, so it's always a little bit bittersweet when you listen to it, but it is one of the more interesting tours of theirs to talk about, and certainly not without its bright spots to listen to. So, without further ado, let's get into it. I would be willing to bet that most of you who have never even listened to the tour have seen, at the very least, the shirts for this tour. They're quite popular amongst people of all ages, even those who don't really listen to Led Zeppelin at all. It's just become one of those cool shirts to wear and give yourself a bit of street cred or whatever. So this tour came after a almost a 2-year break in live performances for them, which was not planned. As I mentioned in the 1975 episode, they were supposed to come back to North America that August, after they had been through the States January, February, March, and then had the shows in London in May, and they were supposed to come back and play several big stadium shows in August and September. And then there was even talk of a little jaunt through Scandinavia later in the fall, and a planned show at the Rose Bowl in January of '76 as well. But that all got canceled when Robert Plant got in a car accident while on vacation in Greece, on the island of Rhodes. I think the accident was in July of '75, and he broke his foot. It might even have been his whole leg. Anyway, he was banged up quite badly, and they flew him. The band got their plane and went to get him and flew him back to England from Greece. Richard Cole talks about it in his book, about how they kind of had to perform a little heist and break him out of the Greek hospital that they didn't feel was up to par, and get him back to England. So anyway, with the tour canceled and not wanting to be totally unproductive, he and Paige went to Malibu and rented a house and began writing songs for what would become their seventh studio album, Presence. Also during this time, they had been forced into tax exile from England, because Dennis Healey, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, had imposed a super tax wherein the very top, 1% of the 1% sort of thing had to pay, I believe it was 95% income tax, which is obviously absurd. And a lot of musicians and other people who had the means to do so at the time became tax exiles, and that's why the Rolling Stones album is called Exile on Main Street, because they were in tax exile in the south of France when they wrote and recorded it. Anyhow, so Paige and Plant rent this house in Malibu and start writing songs for what would become the seventh studio album, Presence. And then in November of '75, they convened with Jones and Bonham at Musicland Studios in Munich, and recorded Presence, and they got the entire thing done in only 18 days because the studio was booked after them by the Stones, actually, who were coming in to record Black and Blue. And I read somewhere one time when I guess they crossed paths when Zeppelin were leaving and the Stones were arriving, and either Mick or Keith asked Paige if they had gotten some decent tracks down, and Paige said, yeah, the whole album's finished, and they were just shocked. I guess the Stones never worked that efficiently in the studio. So they have the seventh album, Presence, recorded and ready to be released. It would finally come out on my birthday, actually, a few years before me, mind you, March 31st, 1976. And it's a little bit less popular than some of their albums that came before, and I think I've read some theories that it's a bit less accessible, at least at first, and I think there's some truth to that. But I've always really liked it, not just because it was released on my birthday, but I think it's sort of musician's music, if you will. There's a bit more complex time signature stuff on things like For Your Life, and really technically proficient and virtuosic playing by Paige, Jones, and Bonham, for sure. I think you might be able to say that it was Bonham's best studio album. It has Achilles' Last Stand, which I think is his most impressive song, and was the one that was the hardest for me to learn. Plant wasn't entirely pleased with his performances on it, however, because he was still confined to the wheelchair when they were recording it, which affects your ability to project your voice and all of that. But I think it kind of fits a lot of the songs and the general mood of the album, which I've seen the members describe as kind of a battle cry from the depths, sort of rallying around each other and sort of defiantly fighting for their survival after being rocked by Plant's accident like that. The track listing, by the way, for Presence is Achilles' Last Stand, For Your Life, Royal Orleans, Nobody's Fault But Mine, Candy Store Rock, Hot's On for Nowhere, and T for One. Unfortunately, only Achilles' Last Stand and Nobody's Fault But Mine would ever make it into the live repertoire. They did play For Your Life at the 2007 reunion show, which was a nice treat, but yeah, it's too bad they didn't include some of the others on the 77 tour, especially, which is why we're here today. So they couldn't tour yet in 76 because Plant was still recovering from his injuries, but then towards the end of 76, and they also were finishing up The Song Remains the Same live album and movie, which was recorded and shot at the final 3 nights of the 73 tour at Madison Square Garden in New York, and that premiered in October of 76. So they're kind of busy with that, and then towards the end of 76, Plant had the green light from the doctors that they would be able to tour if the set list was structured such that he had breaks every 45 minutes to an hour, which it was, and I'll detail that in a minute. So they planned the 77 tour, and at first it was going to start in I think February and finish up in April, so kind of a similar schedule to the 75 tour where it ran January to March, which I'm not sure why they would do that again after it resulted in Plant catching the flu in 75. But anyhow, they ended up having to postpone it because Plant contracted laryngitis. So it ended up running from April 1st until July 24th. It was supposed to go until August 13th, but they ended up having to cancel the last bit. So this was the only tour that they divided up into 3 legs. The first leg, the dates were April 1st, Dallas, April 3rd, Oklahoma City, April 6th, 7th, 9th, and 10th, Chicago, April 12th, Bloomington, Minnesota, which is Minneapolis, April 13th, St. Paul, so also Twin Cities, April 15th, St. Louis, April 17th, Indianapolis, April 19th and 20th, Cincinnati, April 23rd, Atlanta, April 25th, Louisville, April 27th and 28th, Richfield, Ohio, which is basically Cleveland, April 30th, Pontiac, Michigan, which is basically Detroit, and that show actually set the attendance record for paying audience for a single act at the time, 76,229. And then they had a couple week break, and then the second leg was May 18th in Birmingham, Alabama, May 19th, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, May 21st, Houston, May 22nd, Fort Worth, May 25th, 26th, 28th, and 30th, Landover, Maryland, so DC basically, May 31st, Greensboro, North Carolina, June 3rd, Tampa, which was at the Tampa Stadium where they had set the world attendance record at the time 4 years earlier on the 73 tour. That show actually got rained out after, or not that 73 one, the 77 one there got rained out after 3 songs, and unfortunately they weren't able to finish it up the following night because the fans rioted because of the rain out, and the mayor kiboshed the makeup date the next day. And then June 7th, 8th, 10th, 11th, 13th, and 14th in New York at Madison Square Garden. June 19th in San Diego. And June 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 25th, 26th, and 27th in Los Angeles at the Forum. And then another couple week break, and the third leg, July 17th, Seattle, July 20th, Tempe, Arizona, July 23rd and 24th in Oakland at the Coliseum for the Days on the Green festival that was organized by Bill Graham. And there was some trouble at the those Oakland shows backstage. There's a whole kerfuffle about one of Bill Graham's staff stopping a kid from taking one of the dressing room signs, and the kid turned out to be Zeppelin's manager, Peter Grant's son. And when word of that got back to the Zeppelin camp, Bonham, Richard Cole, the tour manager, and Peter Grant, and I believe John Bindon, who the band had hired as the head of security for this tour, who was a former gangster sort of type from London, and a really rough guy who was not the best influence to have along for the ride, went and roughed the guy up pretty bad, who had told Grant's son he couldn't take the sign, and they ended up getting arrested, and they were able to play the show the next day and get out of town. But anyway, not what you like to have happen on tour. And then after that, they flew to New Orleans, and they were supposed to play at the Superdome, which likely would have set another attendance record. That was supposed to be on July 30th. But they had to, when they got to New Orleans, they received word that Robert Plant's son, Carrick, who was 5 at the time, had died of a stomach virus back home in England, and they obviously canceled the rest of the tour immediately and flew home. The other dates that would have happened after that were August 2nd and 3rd in Chicago, which were, one of them was a makeup date for the April 9th show from the first leg, which ended up getting called early after about 7 songs, because Paige was not in a good state. And then August 6th in Buffalo at Rich Stadium, which could have been another attendance record. August 9th and 10th in Pittsburgh. And finally, August 13th in Philadelphia, which at JFK Stadium, which definitely would have been another attendance record. So if they had played all of those shows and not had to cancel the one in August, the tour would have been 51 shows to over 1 million fans, which I believe would have been the first time that had been done. As it turned out, they played 44 and still set the world attendance record for the time, so pretty good. And also in Richard Cole's book, he talks about how there was enough demand, had scheduling allowed, or had they chosen to sell out an additional 2 nights at the Madison Square Garden in New York, and likely at the Forum in Los Angeles as well, which would have meant 8 shows in both of those, which is pretty crazy. And I adjusted that for the population increase since then, and that would be the equivalent of playing 12 or 13 nights at each of those venues today, which is nuts. Even with only doing the 6 nights, that was at the time an unprecedented string of shows on a single tour at the Forum in Los Angeles. Jethro Tull and the Stones had each done 5 there, and Zeppelin did 5 in the LA area in 75, but 2 of them were at Long Beach Arena, which is a bit smaller. But at the time, nobody had played 6 nights at the Forum, so that was a nice feather in their cap as well. And I know the Stones had played 6 at the Garden in 75, so they tied that. I'm not sure if others had done 6 or more at MSG by that point, but anyhow, it speaks to their popularity at the time, even though punk had started to emerge in England especially, and they were really lashing back at what they deemed to be dinosaur rock, and Zeppelin got singled out as sort of the prime example of that in their eyes, with what they deemed to be a lot of self-indulgence and bombast, especially in their live shows, which I can see how you could interpret it that way, but to the Zeppelin faithful, they considered all of the aspects that the punk people took that way to be part of the appeal and part of the magic. I think it's also important to bear in mind that back then, with no YouTube, no internet or anything, it was a lot more difficult to familiarize yourself with what to expect from the live show of a band you hadn't actually seen yourself before. And Since the Song Remains the Same was Zeppelin's first official live album, and that came out in 76, this was the first, and bootlegs were a much newer phenomenon at that time. This was the first tour that they undertook where it was possible for people who hadn't seen them before to get a taste of the live Zeppelin experience by going to see The Song Remains the Same or buying the album. And so I'm sure that endeared them to a new group of fans that hadn't seen them before and may not have otherwise without the release of the film. Now, no matter what the composition of the crowds were as far as new versus old Leadheads, the crowds on this tour were really wild and much more lively than they had been on the 75 tour. And plenty of people on the Zeppelin forum that I'm a part of who saw them multiple times in the 70s make mention of that a lot, how the 75 crowds were pretty sedate. I'm not sure if that's because it was in the winter and they were just, cold and frustrated from the experience of waiting to get in the arena and everything. But they all say that the 77 crowds were back to sort of the rabid atmosphere in the arenas that had been present on the 73 tour. And of course, Zeppelin never used an opening act, and this tour was no exception. A lot of bands use them to sort of get the crowd riled up and kind of already at a certain baseline of excitement before they take the stage. But Zeppelin stopped sharing the bill with other acts very early on. I read a quote from John Paul Jones about why that was, somewhere along the line. I forget where I read it, but he said that they always found opening acts to be more trouble than they were worth as far as going overtime and the hassle of changing over the gear and everything, and they found that the crowds didn't really want them anyway. They were there to see the main thing and just wanted more of them. So it would just be however many hours of silence other than the background music, with them all working themselves up, and then suddenly, usually about an hour late, from based on accounts that I have read again on the forum by people who saw them back then, they would usually the tickets usually said an 8 o'clock start time, and they'd usually come on sometime around 9 and then play for 3 hours. So the crowd would have 2 or 3 hours sitting in the arena to work themselves up, and then finally the lights go down and pandemonium ensues. The set list for this tour, for the most part, was The Song Remains the Same, which was their first time using that as an opener, and I think it's a really cool choice as an opener. It's a ballsy choice because it's not an easy song to kind of work your way into the groove with. It's demanding on all four of them, and it's also over 5 minutes, so it's an unconventional choice for an opener from that point of view, demanding on the audience as well. But they knew that their fans were in it for the long haul and wouldn't be put off by that. And it didn't always work out because by this point they were a little bit inconsistent. Not all of them, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But on the nights when they were on, it was quite a spectacular opener. So anyhow, The Song Remains the Same, transitioning into Sick Again via a sort of 50-second bit of the beginning of The Rover, which is of course from Physical Graffiti, and it's too bad they didn't play the full song at any point in their career, because it's a really good one and a fan favorite. Then it would be Nobody's Fault But Mine, which is the first of the two songs from Presence in the set, followed by In My Time of Dying, then Since I've Been Loving You, and then No Quarter, and then 10 Years Gone, which is the first time they had played that from Physical Graffiti. It's a top 10 Zeppelin song for me, so I think it's really awesome that they played it, but I think I would say it's one of the few Zeppelin songs where I definitively prefer the studio version, and part of that is the lack of bass in the live version. Because there are so many guitar parts in it, they elected to have Jones play some of the other guitar parts that Paige wasn't able to cover himself by oscillating between them, as he would do on other songs with a lot of parts as well, like Achilles' Last Stand. So Jones would play some of the other guitar parts on acoustic, and I think that lack of bass makes it sound a little empty sometimes, but then again, you can never know for sure whether that's just the a product of the sound quality of the bootlegs. I'm sure it would have sounded plenty full if you were actually there in person. And then from there, the acoustic set would start with the Battle of Evermore, which they had never played live before, and this is the only year that they played it, followed by Going to California, and then they would play about a minute and a half of Black Country Woman, transitioning into Brown Rar Stomp. Now, this is the first time they had played Black Country Woman apart from the second night in Seattle in 72, which was the only time that they played the full song. I talked about that in the episode about the 72 tour. And then after Brown Rar Stomp, it would be White Summer Black Mountainside, which had been dropped from the set partway through 1970, but they brought it back in 77, which on its own, I would say it was outdated by 77, but they would transition from Black Mountainside into Cashmere, which was a fantastic transition, and you can imagine how it would have taken the crowds by surprise when they were there in person, because Paige would play White Summer Black Mountainside seated, and then Bonham would be playing along with him in the Black Mountainside part, and then they'd give each other the cue, and Paige would kick his chair out from underneath him, and all of a sudden the lights would flash this cool golden color, and they'd launch into Cashmere, and you can hear the crowd's excitement and surprise at it when you listen back to the audience recordings, especially. And then after Cashmere would be Bonham Solo, which on this tour, for some reason they started it with the Out on the Tiles riff, which had been used as an introduction to Black Dog prior to this, and maybe it's because Black Dog wasn't in the set in 77 and they still liked having the Out on the Tiles riff in there somewhere. But anyway, they used that for the intro riff and then went back to the regular Moby Dick riff at the end of the song. And I suppose because of that, they called his solo Over the Top instead of Moby Dick on this tour. Then after that, it would be Paige's noise solo, which was a new thing on this tour because Dazed and Confused wasn't in the set anymore, likely because of Achilles' Last Stand having evolved out of Dazed, so I suppose they thought it would be duplicitous to play both of them, and also with each successive album and subsequent tour, the set would continue to swell as more material got added, and not wanting to play, over 4 hours a night, because Dazed and Confused had already ballooned to 40 minutes by the end of the 75 tour. I guess they felt it would be just too long of a set if it was still in there, and I'm gonna guess that they also sort of felt like they had evolved it as far as they could by the end of 75. Now, the only problem with dropping Dazed and Confused is it includes Paige's violin bow solo, which had become a real trademark of going to a Zeppelin show, and featured a lot of the coolest visual effects. So they wanted to keep that in the show somehow. So they would do this noise solo bit, it started as like an introduction to Achilles' Last Stand, and then by the end of the tour it had swollen to 15 to 20 minutes, at least by the end of the second leg, and was kind of an adventure in its own right. But Paige would start with this, I don't know the proper term for it, but it kind of sounds like a cat screeching. I'm sure it sounded cool in person, but in this section he would play a little bit of the Star Spangled Banner, and then at the shows in the South he would play a bit of Dixie as well. And on the third night in LA he played a bit of God Save the Queen, in that section as well. And then he would mess around with the toggle switch a little bit, and then move over to the theremin, which is another kind of signature part of their live show, and part of his kind of magician wizard persona. And the theremin was native to A Whole Lot of Love, which by this point was also dropped. It would be brought back a little bit later in this tour, which I'll touch on in a second, but only as a minute long prelude to rock and roll. So we still wanted to include the theremin, so then the noise solo would move to the theremin section, and then on to the bow, and the bow solo would have the same climax that it used to in Dazed and Confused, with Bonham joining in, but then Paige would start Achilles' Last Stand instead of going into the guitar solo in Dazed and Confused, obviously. And then after Achilles' Last Stand, it would be Stairway to Heaven, closing the set proper. And then the encore on most nights was rock and roll, but on the first leg in particular, they would also play Trampled Underfoot as a second encore fairly frequently. So that's the standard set list, but there were some notable exceptions. I guess we'll go chronologically. So as I said, on the first leg especially, it wasn't uncommon for there to be Trampled Underfoot in the encores as well. And then at the beginning of the second leg, or shortly after the beginning, the fourth show of the second leg, they introduced A Whole Lot of Love as the little prelude to rock and roll. They would only play the first minute or so of it, and then that Fort Worth show, they also played It'll Be Me, a Jerry Lee Lewis cover, as a second encore, which they would play twice this year, the fifth LA show being the other. Then on the third night in New York, June 10th, they reintroduced both Over the Hills and Far Away and Heartbreaker to the set list. Over the Hills replaced In My Time of Dying in the fourth slot that night, and Heartbreaker appeared between Over the Top and the noise solo. And then after that, they played In My Time of Dying a few more times, the fourth night in New York and the second and fifth nights in Los Angeles. And then after that, they didn't play it again the rest of the career. So Over the Hills mostly took over the fourth spot from In My Time of Dying at that point in the tour. And then Heartbreaker would be played a few more times as well as the encore, the fourth night in New York, and then in the same spot it had been on the 10th between Over the Top and the noise solo on the fifth night in New York and the first night in Los Angeles. Then the fifth night in New York has Black Dog in the encore after the little minute long Whole Lot of Love tease, and it would also be played on the first night in Oakland, July 23rd. Now, there are a few accounts of it having been played earlier in the tour as well, most notably the first night of the tour, April 1st in Dallas, which the source for that is a LA Times article by a credible journalist for this sort of thing. So I think we can confirm that appearance of Black Dog. And then the second night in Los Angeles is the only show of the tour to have both In My Time of Dying and Over the Hills and Far Away. In My Time of Dying in the fourth slot, and then Over the Hills in that slot where Heartbreaker was played between Over the Top and the noise solo. And then the third, 4th and 6th nights in Los Angeles, they played Trampled Underfoot, Between, Cashmere, and Over the Top. And the 4th night in LA, they played Communication Breakdown, coming out of the Whole Lotta Love tease, which was its only appearance in 1977. And incidentally, it and Heartbreaker are the only two songs that they played every single year of their live career. The only other setlist revision of note is that Bonham Solo was dropped after the first show of the third leg, the Seattle show. And Bonham didn't do his solo in 79 or 80, so this Seattle 77 show is the last time that he ever played it. Overall, I like the 77 set list. I think it's quite lavish and over the top, and in keeping with the general sense of spectacle that went along with this tour. It does have some peculiar sides to it, though. Consider that Jones would go about 2/3 of the show in the middle there without his bass, maybe even longer than 2/3. After the 4th song, whether it was In My Time of Dying or Over the Hills, he wouldn't be playing bass again until Bonham Solo, just the intro and outro, and then really not until Achilles' Last Stand, and then back to the keys for Stairway, and then he would have the bass for the Encore, except for when they did It'll Be Me. So that's kind of funny how he would go for a period of, depending on the night, like 2 hours without his bass, whether he was on keys or acoustic guitar or mandolin, or wasn't on the number at all, like White Summer, Black Mountainside, for instance. So that's kind of interesting, and it speaks to how by this point in their career, and it had started in 73 and even more so in 75, but by this point they were really I'm trying to think how the best way to convey this. They weren't playing, they didn't sound like just a rock band where they go out there and play a set list that's 90% songs with a typical like guitar, bass, drums lineup, and they weren't just a blues rock band. By this point, they were really like, they were playing a set that only they could play. It was completely uniquely Zeppelin by this point. I mean, sure, there were the blues influence and traditional rock stuff was still in there, but the set list wasn't at all playing what you would expect a rock band to play. It was just what they felt was the best representation of their career up until that point, with all of the diversity and musical tangents that went along with that. And I think it's in keeping with the way that they build their concerts and the way that they intended the experience to be. You know, they printed on the tickets starting before 77 an evening with Led Zeppelin. You weren't just going to a 90-minute rock concert where you're going to hear some energetic, testosterone-filled music. You were signing on for a complete audio-visual musical experience and a journey, and one that wasn't necessarily easy. You know, they demanded a lot from their crowds as far as attention span and volume tolerance, and being interested in such a diverse set list. But you know, to quote one of their own songs, they gave no quarter and they asked for no quarter. It was an endurance test on both them and the crowd, but it was worth it. Speaking of No Quarter, I should quickly mention where it was at in its evolution by this point in their career. It as I talked about in the 75 episode, it starts as a 7-minute song on the studio version, and it gets introduced at the start of the North American 73 tour. At first it's around 10 minutes, then it creeps up to 13 or 14 by the end of the 73 tour, and then 75 it starts around 15, and then works its way up to I think as high as in the somewhere around 21, 22 at the last New York show at the end of the first leg in 75. And then of course they add the grand piano, and it starts to get even more jazzy on the second leg, and creeps up to an average in the low to mid 20s, with a couple that are higher than that, like the second night in San Diego in 75, where it was around 31 minutes, and the last night in LA where it was around 30. And then Earl's Court goes back down a bit to the sort of that low mid 20s average. And then starting in 77 now, especially with Dazed and Confused not being in the set list anymore, it was the main signature long jam sequence in the set. And they added a section for the 77 versions, which has been referred to as the sort of the boogie section, but it wasn't always like a boogie. Sometimes it was a blues rock jam. Sometimes it was a Chuck Berry style 50s rock section. Sometimes they would play the theme from the Nutcracker. Anyhow, so that would be inserted kind of at the end of Jones's piano solo as like a little interlude before they went into the Paige's guitar solo section. The addition of this section is kind of a polarizing topic amongst lead heads. I personally don't have a problem with it most nights, although I see where the people who aren't fans of it are coming from, in that it isn't necessarily in keeping with the general dark, gloomy mood of the song. Whereas in the 75 versions, even though they got kind of upbeat and jazzy on the West Coast, especially during the second leg, the slow easing into the guitar solo section from Jones's piano solo, where Bonham comes in first, and you have that piano drum duet for a couple minutes, starting to build the tension, and then Paige working his way in. It stayed in that sort of minor mode and kept the dark vibe of the song intact, whereas this section that they added in 77 could, especially depending upon how smoothly they executed the transitions between Jones's piano solo into the boogie section, out of the boogie section, and then into the guitar solo. Sometimes it could sound a bit abrupt and choppy if the transitions between those sections weren't spot on. But on the nights that it worked, I think it was really cool. Anyhow, so at the start of the tour, it even with adding the section, the song was shorter than the longer versions in 75, back sort of to an average in the low 20s. But then by the end of the second leg, when they got to the New York shows, it started creeping up into the high 20s, and then the fourth night in New York and 4 of the 6 nights in Los Angeles, No Quarter is over half an hour long, and those 5, along with the San Diego 75 one that I mentioned, are the 6 longest versions of it that they ever did. The order goes, the second night in LA is the longest they ever did at 34 minutes, and then the 6th night in LA is second at 33 and a half. The 5th night in LA is third at 32 and a half. And then the fourth night in New York is 31 and a bit, 31 and 3/4 maybe. And then I think fifth is the San Diego 75, and then sixth is the third night in LA, just a little over 30. And then the first night in LA and the fourth night in LA are both around 29 minutes. I think the first night is just over 29 and the fourth night is like 28 and a half. Anyhow, the three-piece section of the jam, so Paige's guitar solo in the middle of No Quarter, had also changed a bit by 77, whereas in 73 it was basically just a Paige solo with Bonham and Jones backing him up. And not to say that they weren't doing cool stuff, but you know what I mean. And then in 75, it was getting more adventurous, and there were hints of the sort of three-way interplay, but it was still kind of like Jones and Bonham were backing Paige's solo. But by 77, it really starts to shift to being a true three-piece jam with the three of them all improvising fairly equally, and some interesting jams come out of that. Now, I mentioned the sense of spectacle that these shows had, and part of that, I think, is just the popularity of the band and the excitement of the crowd at having their first chance to see them in 2 years. But more importantly, I think, is that this was by far the most visually stunning tour of the band's career. The light show and all of that aspect of it, the stage design and everything, was really taken up a notch, even from 75, which was a big step up from 73, which was a big step up from 72 and prior. The stage design for this tour was very clean. It didn't have the mirrors behind them like in 73, and it didn't have the light bulbs along the front of the stage like in 75. It was just big and clean and spread out, with all of the focus being drawn where it should be, onto the four band members themselves. Also important in cleaning up the look of the stage was that starting in 75, so not unique to this tour per se, but starting in 75, they moved the mixing desk from the side of the stage to the front of the house, which eliminates a lot of clutter on the stage and also helps the sound man to create a mix that's ideal for as many sections of the crowd as possible. Speaking of the sound man, I've mentioned before how the band's sound and lighting company was Showco, which is out of Dallas, Texas. But I learned recently in an article I found from a 1978 edition of Melody Maker magazine, an article which was an interview with Rusty Bruschke, I hope I'm saying that right, who was actually one of the three founding members of Showco, but was the one who would be literally running the mixing board on Zeppelin tours. So you're a big deal and the company's premier client when you have one of the founders of the company running your mixing board for you. Anyhow, so they interviewed Rusty before the first show of the third leg on this 77 tour, the show at the Kingdom in Seattle, and he went into amazing detail, much more than I could comprehend, but it was cool to read it nonetheless, about everything that went into their sound setup and how they had to design a system, especially for Zeppelin, to be able to handle their immense volume requirements. And it said in the article that for the stadium shows on this 77 tour, the sound system had a capacity of 60,000 watts. Now, to put that in perspective, my car has 100 watts in its system, and that's above average. I think the average is either 40 or 60. So you can imagine just how loud it would have been. And all of the accounts that I read of people who saw them, not just on this tour, but anytime, say that they're by far the loudest band that they've ever seen. I mean, the closest I have come to that probably would be when I saw AC/DC in 2015 at Downsview Park here in Toronto, and my ears were still ringing for at least a day afterwards, and that was an outdoor show. I read an account in, I think it was the YouTube comments of Achilles' Last Stand from the last show of the tour in Oakland, which was obviously outside, and the person said that his ears were ringing for a week. So yeah, it would have been quite something to experience just the power of their sound system alone. And one fellow in particular on the Zeppelin forum, his username Strider, who saw them 14 times in the 70s, said that the sort of the fifth member of the band was just the sheer physical presence of their sound. And it is somewhat of a strange phenomenon how certain artists have a different volume threshold or range in which they sound ideal. And I do find that Zeppelin are one where you really have to crank it to get the maximum effect. Another factor that contributed to the increased visual spectacle of this tour was Bonham changing drum kits. He had started in 69 and 70 with the natural wood looking Ludwig kit, and then towards the end of the 1970 shows he switched to the Emerald Sparkle Ludwig kit, which is my favorite, at least aesthetically. I think I'd probably say sonically as well, between that and the natural wood looking one. But then so he used the green sparkle up until the start of the North American 73 tour, at which point he switched to the amber Vistalite Ludwig kit, which is the orange clear one. If any of you are familiar with the pictures of that, and is the one that you would see if you watch The Song Remains the Same movie. And I think part of his reason for switching to that was it's known as being a bit louder and more kind of sharper, more aggressive as far timbre-wise, as far as its ability to cut through a loud mix and project in bigger venues. And he used that kit for the 73 North American tour and all of the 75 shows. But then for 77, he switched again, this time to a stainless steel Ludwig kit, which looked really cool, and more importantly, enabled the lighting guys to flash different colored lights on each of the drums, and it would reflect and look like it was that color. And they would do this especially during his solo, which apparently from people who were there would make it look like each drum was lighting up its own color when he hit it, which is pretty cool. And they also put Bonham's drum riser on tracks for this tour so that it could slide to the front of the stage during his solo and give people an even better view of him and of those lighting tricks that they were performing on his kit. The rack tom on this kit was also a little bit bigger than the one on the previous kits. Before this, all of the kits had a 10 by 14 rack tom, but the rack tom for the stainless steel kit, I believe, is 13 by 15, I think. So just contributed to a even more massive sound from him. And then gear change wise, Jones also switched to an alembic bass for this tour, which were really popular at the time. And I didn't realize until recently when I was listening to an episode of the Grateful Dead's new podcast where they were talking about Bear, Owsley Stanley, their sound guy. And apparently the whole alembic company was a Grateful Dead project, starting their own kind of instrument line. So that was kind of cool to learn. And part of the appeal of the alembic bass for Jones was that they were able to send it straight to the PA rather than miking bass amps, which Rusty talks about in that article in the Melody Maker issue from '78 that I mentioned a few minutes ago, about how that really improved his ability to create a nice mix and get a really good bass sound. Unfortunately, the alembic doesn't come through as nicely on bootlegs as his Fender Jazz bass that he used before this does, and it doesn't have the nice warm sound that the Fender Jazz did. It sounds kind of tinny a lot of times on the recordings, particularly the soundboards, but according to people who saw this tour in person, it sounded plenty thunderous in person and much better than it sounds on the bootlegs. Now, as far as Paige's contributions to the visual aspect of this tour, first we have to mention the outfits, as usual with him. In the 75 episode, I talked about how he had really started wearing more out there and kind of esoteric outfits that clearly differentiated performer from audience. And he took that a step further even in 77 by switching to a white silk suit that one of the tops had like a poppy on it, and then there was also a sort of variation of it where that looked a lot more like a white version of the dragon suit that he unveiled in 75. There's also one instance that I guess you have to mention at the April 10th show in Chicago. He wore a stormtrooper outfit, which featured tall black leather boots and a Nazi stormtrooper hat, which is an unfortunate wardrobe choice. I'm not sure what was behind that. Paige was also very energetic on this tour as far as his on-stage movements and everything, which is really impressive considering that he had started to slip into heroin addiction by this point and was a 26-inch waist on this tour. So it's when you see the clips of fan footage and stuff, it's amazing to see this spindly, bordering on sickly looking figure gyrating and twirling and making all these acrobatic and serpentine movements while carrying a very heavy guitar. The Les Paul is one of the heavier guitars out there, and then the double neck, which he used on The Song Remains the Same, Sick Again, and Stairway, is even heavier, and he would do some crazy movements with that. Like, I've seen clips from this tour of him dropping down into the splits and hopping back up and stuff while he's strapped to the double neck during The Song Remains the Same. Just nuts. I don't know how he did it. And also with respect to the visual aspect, the light show and the use of lasers went up another notch in 77. As I mentioned in the 75 episode, they had become the first group to take a laser on tour, but it was just the one beam. And in 77, they made a much more extensive use of lasers. They would project some of them onto the roof during Jones's piano solo in No Quarter, and then use them in a couple other areas, but really unleash the full power of the light show during Paige's noise solo. And the noise solo is one of the parts of the show that doesn't come through nearly as well on the bootlegs as it did in person. It can, for some people, they find it hard to enjoy it when they're just listening back to the bootlegs, but based on pretty much any account you read of the shows from somebody who actually went to them, it was absolutely a highlight of the show, because it sounded way better in the venue, but the light show that accompanied it was absolutely breathtaking. And I think it's important to mention the interest in space exploration and all of that was prevalent at the time. I mean, you had the moon landing in '69, but the interest in space had only continued to progress from there with Star Trek and shows about aliens and space travel and whatnot. And then probably most notably in the context of this tour is that the first Star Wars movie was released on May 25th of '77. So especially the people at the shows after that, any of them who had gone to see Star Wars, which was probably a lot of them since it shattered a ton of box office records, would have been no doubt amazed to find that stuff that they had just seen taking place in a galaxy far, far away was taking place in real life as well. So at this point, I should quickly go over the state of the four of them as performers by the time we get to this tour. And don't worry, we're going to get to the ranking of the shows soon. So Plant overall was much better than he had been in '75 at least, and probably better than '73, certainly more consistent than '73. Although on his good nights in '73, he still had his true high range. But yeah, '77, he had fully adjusted to his post-surgery voice and was singing with more power and consistency than he had since at least '72. So that was nice, and especially during his sort of like mid-tour peak at the end of the second leg at the New York and Los Angeles shows. Paige was pretty inconsistent this tour, and a little bit sloppy. He had obviously recovered from the broken finger that plagued him through a lot of the '75 tour, but he had traded it for a worse problem with a developing heroin habit, which contributed a lot to his inconsistency and sloppy play a lot of times on this tour. But when he was sober and focused, particularly the New York and Los Angeles runs, he did recapture a lot of his former glory and play, if not quite to a '73 and prior level, pretty close. And because of those two peaking at the New York and Los Angeles shows, you'll notice when I get to the rankings that the top part of the list is heavily populated with the New York and LA shows, because Jones and Bonham were pretty solid the whole way through. Jones, as always, was very solid this tour. Probably the most unique aspect of his playing on this tour, apart from the switch to the alembic bass, would be that his piano solos in No Quarter took more of a classical turn, where they had been really jazzy in '75. they were much more classically influenced in 77. The brightest and most consistent star of the show in 77, though, would have to be Bonham. I think there's a strong case to be made that this was his best tour. Its competition, and the one that I would probably choose for his best tour is Europe 73, but this 77 tour is very similar to it in that on those two tours he was really playing aggressively on just about every song every night, and some call it overplaying. I think most times it fit and wasn't derailing anything or detracting from the song itself, so I don't really find it a problem, and I think calling it overplaying kind of carries some negative connotations, but he was definitely playing very aggressively, not as much with the bass drum. I think his the really aggressive and fast bass drum playing aspect of his game, if you will, peaked in 69, 70, maybe 71 as well. It's a bit of a peculiar skill, because I think the muscle groups that contribute to that ability are not very often used when you do anything else. So you can lose that really fast foot very quickly if you don't continue to play in that style. And he certainly still had a very fast foot, but he didn't utilize the style of bass drum playing that you hear on Good Times, Bad Times, for instance, as often in the later years. But Achilles' Last Stand has a very demanding bass drum part, especially to play at that tempo for 10 minutes straight. So his bass drum playing obviously was still good on this tour as well, but the main area where you notice his very aggressive playing is with the hands. Lots of aggressive fills and throwing in crashes and snare rolls and stuff in places where you might not usually expect them. And I'm not sure if part of this was sort of a conscious effort to compensate for Paige's inconsistency and fill the gap in the soundscape. I'm sure that was probably part of it, but he was also feeling a little bit slighted from having finished second to Karen Carpenter in the Playboy poll for favorite drummer back in 1975. Actually, it came out during the 75 tour, but he was still kind of irked by that and very much motivated to settle once and for all that he was the best in the world. So a different cause of his aggressive playing than Europe 73, which in that case it was brought on by the absence of Moby Dick in the set list, so he had to incorporate his showboating into all the other songs. But the same result, a very aggressive and powerful Bonham out to prove something every single night. Okay, the last thing then that I want to touch on quickly before I get into the ranking is the recordings. This tour has 7 shows for which a recording is yet to surface, the so-called missing 7. Those are the opening night in Dallas, April 1st, the Minneapolis, April 12th, St. Paul, April 13th, St. Louis, April 15th, Indianapolis, April 17th, Baton Rouge, May 19th, and Greensboro, May 31st, which was Bonham's birthday. Of those, I would say the most desirable ones are the Baton Rouge one and the Greensboro one. Both of them, the there was a show the night before that we do have a recording of, and in both cases, the shows the night before were really good. So it's safer to assume that those two missing ones were also really good shows. And in the case of Baton Rouge, Zeppelin always seemed to play really well in that New Orleans, Baton Rouge area, and anywhere in the Deep South for that matter. And based on accounts of people who were there, it was quite a good one. And then for the Greensboro show, being Bonham's birthday, I'm sure that it was a very good one. And I read an account of somebody who was at that show on the section for it in the official timeline on Zeppelin's website, where they said it was very good, and also suggested that Black Dog had been played, which would be one of the few times it was played in 77. So it would be cool to have Greensboro for that reason. As far as the first leg ones, having the first night would be cool to hear the live debuts of some of the songs that were new to the set this year. And first nights are always interesting, but I think it's safe to say that it would prove to be a pretty rusty performance if we finally get a recording of it. Part of that is because of the delay due to Plant's laryngitis. He caught it close enough to when the tour was supposed to start that all of their gear had already been shipped over to the States from England. So they ended up going several weeks without practicing before the start of the tour because of the delay. So that contributed to the sloppy start. There are a decent number of soundboard recordings for this tour, but they don't sound as rich and full as the 75 boards do, which I'm not entirely sure why, because presumably 2 years later, with all of the improvements they had made to their sound system and the increasing technology and everything, you'd think that they would sound at least as good, if not better. And a recent post that I saw on Royal Orleans, another online forum, somebody found pictures from lots of different tours and gave a very detailed account of how the soundboards were recorded each year. And it had long been thought that the 75 boards were recorded on reel-to-reel as opposed to cassette for all the other tours, but photos confirmed that the 75 boards were recorded on cassette as well. So it's still a bit of a mystery as to why the 75 ones sound so good. But anyhow, the 77 ones sound a little bit thin and tinny, especially Jones's bass, but I've heard some really good remasters lately. The first New York show in particular, the Northbridge remaster, sounds fantastic and really helped me to see that show in a different light. The audience recordings from this tour are not without their faults as well. A lot of them are not the greatest, and they have a kind of metallic sound to them. I think part of that is Jones's alembic bass, and part of it is Bonham's stainless steel kit, but it can make them a little rough on the ears. There's also no official releases from this tour other than the bootleg recording of The Song Remains the Same from the first night in LA, appearing in the menus of one of the discs of the official DVD that came out in 2003, which makes this and 1980 the only years with absolutely no representation in official releases. Well, in 68 as well, but there were far fewer shows that year. The Seattle show, however, does have video that's been available in bootleg form since the 80s, and you can find easily on YouTube. The problem is it's not video that was professionally shot with the view to release it in the future. It's just what was shot for the in-house video screens at the stadium. So it's all close-ups, and it's also not the best quality. I think it's a couple generations removed from the master tapes, and the audio that accompanies it is very dry and lifeless sounding. There have been some good remasters of it that have gotten the most out of it. The title that I have is Godfather Records' Conquering Kingdom, and it sounds pretty good, but still nowhere near a good soundboard from 75, or even one of the remastered true soundboards from a different night in 77, like the first night in New York. And also the Seattle show doesn't show the band in their best light. Bonham's playing really well, but Paige looks even more sickly than he had earlier in the tour. I think he had a relapse with the heroin between the second and third legs, and it's not his best night, and he's much less animated as far as his onstage movements as well. And Plant is pretty hoarse in addition to that. So it's unfortunate that show is one of the ones that most people have heard from this tour, if they have heard anything from this tour, and I think contributes to the not so great reputation that this tour has, as does the first night in Cleveland, which was the first soundboard to become available from this tour. However, just when it appeared that all was lost, about a month ago, a group of fans released a project that they had no doubt been working on for quite a while, where they took the best of the Los Angeles audio, which means that they mostly used the first, third, fourth, and sixth nights, because those are the ones that were recorded by Mike Millard, who I mentioned in the 75 episode. And they synced up the best of the LA audio with fan footage from dates all throughout the tour, and interspersed that with clips from the Seattle video, and so synced up the mix of the fan shots and the Seattle video with the best of the LA audio, and it looks really professional. They made it look and sound as close to a official DVD of this tour that we're likely ever going to get, and that's called Badge Holder Blues, and is most definitely worth watching. You can only get it if it's sent to you, but if you listen to this and are interested in seeing it, let me know, and I will try to pass your inquiry along to one of them, and see if we can't get you a copy, because it's one of the coolest Zeppelin products I have experienced, and probably the best job of simulating actually going to one of their shows. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the ranking of the shows. I chose to cap it at a top 20. I know I did a top 25 for the 75 shows, but mainly because of the sound quality, but also the fact that 7 of the shows are missing. There are fewer of the shows that I have listened to for the 77 tour than is the case for 75, and with the general inconsistency of the performances on this tour, especially in the earlier part, I think a top 20 sufficiently captures the ones that are worth listening to. At number 20, I have the final night in Chicago on April 10th. This is the first show of the tour that's really one that's worth hearing, and it's quite good. It's also one of the worst sounding recordings of their whole career. I didn't even listen to it this year because I started to and abandoned ship because of the sound quality. But it is a pretty good show, and could potentially be ranked higher if it sounded a little better. Number 19, I have the Houston show on May 21st. This one is a soundboard. Bonham plays fantastically this show, as he usually did in Texas. And Jones is solid as always, but Paige is a little sloppy, and it's not Plant's best night. Interestingly, Bonham repeatedly shouts for Over the Hills and Far Away after In My Time of Dying, but the rest of the band do not oblige. It's also funny how he yells, pick it up, as they're transitioning into Sick Again, perhaps sensing the sloppy play coming from Jimmy. At number 18, I have the Seattle show that I mentioned a few times already at the start of the third leg there on July 17th. A bit of a similar story to the Houston one as far as Bonham being on fire, but Paige and Plant not having their best nights. Although I do think the presence of the video and the thin nature of the accompanying soundtrack have actually done this show a disservice as far as people's perception of it. It's not one of the better shows of the tour, but Bonham is definitely on fire, and it does have some songs that are pretty good versions. It's a really cool version of No Quarter. It has one of Paige's better solos in Stairway to Heaven, and a unique Bronner stomp with Paige breaking a string and them doing a little jazzy improvisation, Plant, Bonham, and Jones, that is, with Plant even tapping on Jones's upright bass with a drumstick. And Plant jokes about it after the song, saying that at least they know they can play in the hotel bar after the show. And the Seattle show also features a very good solo from Bonham, which of course turned out to be the last one that he ever did. And it's kind of funny that it ended up being the last. I'm not sure if they had already intended to drop it after that show and only did it because they love playing in Seattle or something, but it's a very retrospective sounding version. He includes sections from pretty much every era of the solo, and even ones that he had abandoned several years earlier. And he also plays a bit of Bonzo's Montreux, which of course wouldn't appear until 1982 on the posthumous album Coda. And it's interesting because this is the only instance where the Seattle show is not one of, if not the best show of the tour, because it was always one of their favorite places to play. At number 17, I have the first show of the second leg, May 18th in Birmingham, Alabama. This one is an audience recording, but a decent sounding one. And they start off pretty well out of the gate for the second leg. They always seem to play well in the Deep South, as I mentioned. Paige plays a bit of Dixie in the noise solo before Achilles' Last Stand. And yeah, it's just an overall pretty energetic and powerful and reasonably tight show, not overly stretched out like some of the later shows would be in June, which is a matter of personal preference, whether you think that's a positive or a negative. For me, I kind of like the more stretched out versions of the songs that lend themselves to that potential, which is why I have it a bit lower, I think, but I've seen plenty of people put this in their top 10, and I don't think that's a terribly erroneous take. At number 16, I have the first New York show on June 7th. This one is a soundboard and is the one that I mentioned where I just recently acquired the Northbridge remaster, which sounds significantly better than the original Empress Valley release of the soundboard that I had for a while, Magical Sound Boogie. Yeah, the remaster really shone this show in a new light, and is why I have it ahead of Birmingham, which I wouldn't have before hearing the remaster. Bonham is especially lively during No Quarter at this show. In the acoustic set, Paige and Plant play a little bit of Rawhide, which is points for uniqueness anyway. You can tell that they were excited to be back in New York and to have arrived at the part of the tour with their absolute favorite places, New York and Los Angeles, Seattle too, of course, but that wasn't until the third leg. But the New York shows got better as they went along, so this first night on June 7th is pretty good, but only a taste of things to come. Which brings us to number 15, the second night in New York, June 8th. This one's a little hard to judge because it's another with quite rough sound quality, but it sounds like if a better recording surfaced, it could climb a little higher. Bonham especially plays really well. Paige is much better than the night before, and it's an overall tight and powerful show from what you can make out through the murky sound quality. At number 14, I have the last night in New York, June 14th. This one could be a bit higher, but the recording cuts off during Over the Top, Bonham Solo. So we're left without the last third of the show with the noise solo, Achilles, Stairway, and the Encores, which is why I have it down here, because we don't know how well those were played and whether or not there were any last night treats as far as additions beyond the standard set list towards the end there. But the 2/3 that we do have are pretty good, if a notch below the night before, which we'll get to in a bit. The highlights for this one, I would say, are the No Quarter and the acoustic set. At number 13, I have the last night in Landover, May 30th. This one was a pretty bad audience recording for a long time, but a soundboard surfaced a few years back, which has helped me gain a new appreciation for it. It has a very good version of Achilles' Last Stand. Jones plays a passage from a classical composer named Rachmaninoff during the piano solo in No Quarter, which is neat, and you can tell that they're starting to hit their stride as they make their way into June. Also, it's possible that I have this one a little bit too low, but I'll be honest, I am blanking a little bit on the details of it because my dog actually passed away on May 30th this year, so I was a little bit distracted when I was listening to it. But yeah, it could be a few spots higher. Number 12, I have the fourth night in New York, June 11th. This one starts off with a decent audience recording from the beginning through Since I've Been Loving You. And then there's a soundboard which covers No Quarter, 10 Years Gone, and goes a little bit into the start of the acoustic set, and then it's back to the the audience recording that started it off. But then just as Cashmere is beginning, it flips to a much worse audience recording, which runs for the duration of the show and makes it pretty hard to judge the final third of the show. It does feature Heartbreaker as the encore, which is unique. It's the only time Heartbreaker appeared as an encore this year, and one of only 4 times that they played it in 77. The highlight of this show is most definitely No Quarter. It's one of the coolest versions. Jones plays a very elaborate and enjoyable piano solo with a cool electric piano intro. And then the midsection is long and quite interesting, with lots of good interplay between Paige, Jones, and Bonham, and different textures and whatnot. And of course, it's the 4th longest version, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. At number 11, I have The Last Night in Los Angeles, June 27th. This, of course, would turn out to be the last time that they ever played in LA, which was their home away from home and their favorite place to play. And it's very strange when Plant is saying the final thank you and farewell after the encore. He says that it's been a crazy week and everything, and then says that they never thought that they would be back, and now they have come back. And he says, and we shall come back again. I think a weird, I don't know if it was a premonition or what, but it's always kind of spooky listening to it now, knowing the events that would transpire afterwards. As far as the show itself, it definitely has that last night in a town, last night of the tour sort of feel. You can see the parallels between it and the last night in LA in 1975, which was also closing the second leg, in that case, closing the tour, wherein you can really hear Paige trying to stretch out every song as far as he can stretch it, in every different direction. I think he does that a bit more successfully in the case of the 75 show. But this Last Night in LA in 77 is not without its highlights. It kind of has the feeling, though, that, the mind was willing, but the body was weak. I think they were pretty tired and ready to fly home for the break, but they still managed to pull some good stuff out of the hat. It has the second longest No Quarter, as I mentioned a little bit ago, at 33.5 minutes, and it's a very good version. One of the best. I think Jones's piano solo is long and very interesting. And Paige plays a pretty good solo, and there's some good interplay in the midsection. One curious thing that I've noticed is Paige never actually gets around to the signature motif that you hear in the guitar solo on the studio version. The night before, the 5th night in LA, he waits till very close to the end to play it, but he still plays it. But on this last night in LA, he never gets around to it, which I'm not sure if that was deliberate or he forgot or figured that they had already been playing long enough and decided to just end it. But it does reach a cool climax, and the climax and ensuing wind down back into the final verse is very well executed at this show. Paige also plays a really cool prologue to the intro to Over the Hills and Far Away. And Over the Hills is one of the longer versions, reaches 8 minutes. Paige's solo on it is interesting. It's not his best from a technical perspective, but it's okay. Jones plays some interesting bass parts in the middle of it that always give me sort of Miss You vibes. The Stones song that wouldn't come out for another year, so obviously it's not like he had heard it and was deliberately doing that. I wonder if Bill Wyman was at this show. I've never read anything to that effect, so I don't think so. Don't go running with that. At one point, Plant sort of alludes to how much they like playing in LA and to the fact that it's the sixth night, and says it's starting to feel like their front room. He says he's seen so many faces he's seen before, it's unbelievable. And then somewhat off mic says, like, how you doing, to one lucky fan at least. The show also has one of Plant's best introductions of Jones. Before No Quarter, he introduces him as the man who went to sleep last night with some strawberry tart in the pockets of his jeans. And then after the song says something about it again, and says for a man who always stayed out of the spotlight, he's getting a lot of strawberry pie, which always gets a chuckle out of me, at least. Bonham is a little bit erratic at this show. I think it's probably mostly out of just an adventurous, creative mood, trying to spice it up on the last night, especially for people who might have been to several of the shows that week. And for the most part, it works out okay and adds some interest. But on Achilles' Last Stand, I think it doesn't really fit that well, and I always find it a bit distracting. And Plant kind of alludes to that after the song. He says, was that Keith Bonham on the drums? Suggesting that he had played it a little bit more the way Keith Moon might have. And this show does have two additions to the standard set list. In the acoustic set, which is the main highlight of the show and one of the best acoustic sets of their career. It's 3 set list additions. So in the acoustic set, they play a little bit of Muddy Waters, I Just Can't Be Satisfied, between Going to California and Black Country Woman. And then during Brown Rar Stomp, Paige ends up leading them into the first appearance of Dancing Days since the second night in Detroit in 73, and the last time that they would ever play it. So it's interesting to hear it with Paige on acoustic. And afterwards, Plant says, 1 year off, we haven't played Dancing Days for 5 years. I don't think we will again either, which turned out to be correct, of course. So that's about all I have to say about the last night in LA, which brings us to number 10. And I have at number 10, the second night in Cleveland, April 28th. This one is a so-so audience recording. It sounds pretty powerful and atmospheric, but it's not the clearest. This show, though they're playing very well, much better than the first night in Cleveland. It's powerful, tight, energetic, and features a really cool version of No Quarter, which unfortunately has a sizable cut in it. If without the cut, it might well rank as one of the better versions of all time. This show also has a very good Achilles' Last Stand. Plant sings it really well, and it's one of the darker versions of the song. Paige's solo on Stairway to Heaven is also very good this show, and it's a fantastic version of Since I've Been Loving You. Plant and Bonham also get into a little bit of Surrender by Elvis, I believe after Since I've Been Loving You. You can tell that they're definitely starting to hit their stride towards the end of the first leg, which was a pattern that we saw on the 75 tour, if you'll recall from a few weeks ago. At number 9, I have the third night in New York, June 10th. I expect I might take some heat for having this one this far back. I know it's some people's favorite show of the year. The recording is pretty good, a tad rough compared to a few of the ones that I have just ahead of it, which could be part of what's affecting my opinion of it. It's very good. It has a unique no quarter in that Jones switches back to the electric piano partway through the guitar solo section, which he did not do very often once he had switched to the grand piano. One of the other such versions that comes to mind is the second night at the Forum in 75. So it's unique for that, and it's a good no quarter. It's most unique for having the 77 debuts of Over the Hills and Far Away and Heartbreaker, and both are played really well. It has a very interesting noise solo, and Paige is really starting to stretch it out. By this point, I think it clocks in around 15 minutes. And then Achilles' Last Stand is pretty powerful. It's overall a very tight show. It has a bit of that more business-like approach to the New York shows that I mentioned in the I can't recall if I mentioned it in the 75 or the 72 episode, but yeah, it's very focused and a good show, and I fully acknowledge that I could be underrating it a bit here. I try to make these rankings as objective as possible, but subjectivity is always going to creep in a little bit, and just based on personal preference, I don't enjoy it quite as much as the two that it was in competition with that ended up just ahead of it. At number 8, I have the Fourth Night in Los Angeles, June 25th. Paige plays pretty well this night, but Bonham is a little bit more subdued than usual, and makes a couple slight but noticeable to the ear of someone who's paying close attention mistakes that are a little bit uncharacteristic more in the early part of the show. It has the most basic or paint by numbers or least interesting, however you want to put it, no quarter out of the 6 LA shows, in my opinion. It does feature perhaps the all-time best version of Cashmere, certainly one that's in the conversation. All 4 of them play it really well, no mistakes. I think partly because there was a significant mistake in Cashmere on the 3rd night in LA, so I think they were motivated to make up for that. And Bonham really goes absolutely nuts during the outro with some incredibly thunderous and unique fills, which perhaps were to make up for his sluggish start to the show that I'm sure he would have been aware of. He was always a pretty keen critic of his own performances. It features the last time that they ever played, In My Time of Dying, and it's a pretty good version. They include a little bit of Rip It Up, the Little Richard song. It has a very good Since I've Been Loving You, especially from Paige. He also plays a fantastic solo in Stairway, one of his best. This has one of the better 77 versions of Trampled Underfoot between Cashmere and Over the Top. It has by far the longest over the top of the LA shows at just under 27 minutes. And it's a decent version of it, but there's at least one better long version in 77, which I'll get to in a second. And Plant has an interesting plantation during the acoustic set where he refers to the Battle of Evermore as a place that's, reminiscent of rural England. And he says the parts of the world where the McDonald's hamburgers are not sold. And a perturbed woman in the crowd also says at one point during the acoustic set, "And did you know that it's against the law to rock and roll in the United States of America?" Which always cracks me up. The most unique aspect about this show, however, which I mentioned earlier, is the Encore, which features Whole Lotta Love leading into Communication Breakdown, its only appearance in 1977. And they play it quite well for it being the only time that they played it this year. Before they start the Encore, Plant also greets Laurie Maddox, who was Paige's groupie girlfriend in Los Angeles for several years in the mid-70s. And Plant says that Led Zeppelin salutes a permanent badge holder, which was their euphemism for groupies. At number 7, I have the Fort Worth show on May 22nd. This one is kind of similar to the 1975 show in Fort Worth, in that it might not be the very tightest of the tour, but it's very powerful and energetic and has a kind of fresh, unique feel to it, which makes it a really enjoyable listen. It was a decent audience recording for many years, and then a few years back a soundboard of it surfaced, which was a welcome treat. Bonham is unbelievably strong this night, one of his best nights of the tour, on a tour where he was already playing at an extremely high level. This was one of his favorite places to play from what you can extrapolate from the recordings, and 77 was no exception. During In My Time of Dying, he throws in a little bit of the groove from the crunge towards the end and totally throws Paige off in the process, which is, I suppose you have to detract points for how long it took Paige to get back on track, but it does give it some uniqueness too, and it's kind of funny. Before the song, they have a bit of a false start because Paige's guitar cut out or something, and just before that, Plant had apologized for being late, but said there's a few clouds in the sky between here and New Orleans, if you know what I mean, referring to how they would stay in sort of a hub city for each section of the tour and then just fly to the gigs and back so that they didn't have to pack and unpack all the time. And then after the false start, he says there's a few clouds on stage too, which I always thought was a funny kind of ribbing of Jimmy. After that, there's a very good Since I've Been Loving You. And then a very interesting no quarter with Bonham really stealing the show in the midsection and throwing in an incredible variety of patterns and textures and everything, and really giving it a unique feel. And then the acoustic set is pretty good. Plant ad-libs Hot Diggity It's Hard during going to California, which is an amusing little nod to Texas. And then Cashmere at this show is especially powerful and one of the better versions I've heard. One of the another chap on the Zeppelin forum, whose username is The Rover, saw them in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in both 75 and 77. And he said that the Fort Worth 77 version of Cashmere was probably the highlight of all of the Zeppelin shows he went to. And it's certainly a powerful version. After that, we get what I would say is probably Bonham's best solo of the tour, about a 28-minute version of Over the Top that is very interesting throughout. Bonham does a cool section with a very tight little roll on the snare, close to the edge of the head, so like towards the outer section, very close to the rim where the head's a bit tighter, and like does a roll there and then echoes it with the bass and the toms, and alternates like that for a little bit as he's building tension towards the explosion that culminates the section with the sticks before he plays with his hands. So I always enjoy listening to that version, and it's, if I had to pick a version of Moby Dick to listen to just on its own, not as part of a show that I'm listening to in its entirety, this is one of the ones that I often choose. And then Paige again throws in a bit of Dixie during the noise solo, due to them being in the South, and that flows into a very good Achilles' Last Stand, one of my favorite versions, because again Bonham is tearing it up this night, and Achilles is one of his best showcases, just very aggressive with the fills and everything, and the others managed to mostly match it for a very good version. And Stairway is pretty good. I like Paige's solo on this version. And then this show also features one of the most interesting strings of encores on this tour. Bonham plays a unique kind of stuttering prelude to the intro proper to Rock and Roll, coming out of the Whole Lotta Love minute-long tease, which actually debuts this night. So the encores start with the first appearance of Whole Lotta Love in 77. They play just over a minute of it, and then Bonham does the stuttering extended intro to Rock and Roll, and then they come back out, and Plant says that it's unlike them to extend the warm hand of musical friendship, which is true. They hardly ever had guest appearances. But the guitarist for Bad Company, who were signed to Zeppelin's label, Swan Song, their guitarist Mick Ralphs was in attendance, and they bring him out to play Jerry Lee Lewis's It'll Be Me, and they play it really well, and it's nice to finally have it in soundboard quality, to hear it in all of its glory. A very special and unique moment in their career, and helped to give this show a boost over a few of the ones behind it. So like I say, might not be the absolute most technically proficient or tightest of the tour, but between Bonham being really on fire the whole night and the uniqueness of the encore, it's just a really fun and enjoyable one to listen to. So that is number 7, Fort Worth. At number 6, I have the Pontiac Silverdome show, the last show of the first leg, April 30th, and the one that set the world attendance record at the time with a crowd of 76,229. They were definitely aware that they were breaking the world attendance record that night, and they seem up to the task as far as putting on a proportionately special performance. This is perhaps Paige's best night of the year. Certainly in the top, I want to say top 3 in that respect. He's very on right from the start, and plays with incredible fluency and precision, especially by 77 standards. The the show's an audience recording that is, I would say, mediocre, but it's clear enough. It's a little bit distant, but it sounds very just massive. I like it because it accurately captures the, like I say, just the scale of their sound, and it sounds appropriately huge. It sounds like Paige's riffs are being carved out of granite. I mean, just a really big sound. I think part of part of that is the acoustics of the dome, maybe adding some extra echo and whatnot. But yeah, it's a good recording as far as atmosphere goes. And as far as the songs themselves, it's a strong opening, a good Since I've Been Loving You, a very good No Quarter with an especially good solo from Paige. The acoustic set is good. Nothing really jumps out as particularly noteworthy, just well played all around. Achilles' Last Stand is one of my favorite versions. It's played a tad slower than usual. In fact, most of the songs are this show, which has always led me to wonder if there's any credence to the rumors that this show was professionally filmed. There are shots of cameramen on the stage. People have always assumed that this was just for in-house video, like the Seattle show. But I've always wondered if the slightly more deliberate tempos were because they knew that they were filming and recording it, and they only having one night at the venue as opposed to 3 to work with, like they had for The Song Remains the Same, wanting to make sure that they got it right. But anyway, it lends I think that contributes to the big sound of the recording as well. The slightly slower tempos just sounds, gives them, the songs, a sense of inertia, and sounds very heavy and powerful. And Achilles' Last Stand benefits from that a lot. It also benefits, of course, from Paige having a really good night. And then the encores are very good. They play rock and roll with the house lights on because I guess trouble in the crowd was causing the venue people to put the house lights on, but then Plant's able to insist that they take them down before the second encore of Trampled Underfoot, which is played very slow and deliberately, as it often was when it was an encore in this first part of the tour. And usually I don't like it slow like that, but this one, combined with the recording, I really like it slow like this. It sounds super heavy. So yeah, hopefully the rumors will turn out to be true, and some professional recording and or footage of this show will emerge eventually. And if not, at least hopefully the soundboard will surface at some point so that we can hear this very good performance with a little more clarity. At number 5, I have one that is probably also going to be a tad controversial. The third night in Los Angeles, June 23rd. A lot of people have this as their favorite 77 show, and they're not completely out to lunch to say that by any stretch. It's a very good show. I just find it a tad sloppy compared to the first 2 nights in LA, and also to the other 2 that I have in my top 5 that you will see soon. This show has the major screw up in Cashmere that I mentioned when talking about the June 25th show, which drags it down a bit. And it also has 2 factors that were beyond their control that contribute to the little bit of sloppy feeling. Paige's guitar strap on the double neck breaks during The Song Remains the Same, causing him to finish the song sitting on the edge of Bonham's drum riser, which affects his fluency during the solos a bit. And then he stops to grab his Les Paul before they go into the Rover and Sick Again, which makes this the only show of the year that doesn't have the seamless transition from The Song Remains the Same into the Rover and Sick Again. Now, it is a very good version of Sick Again once they launch into it after Paige switching to the Les Paul, one of the better ones. And they follow that with a very good Nobody's Fault But Mine, a strong Over the Hills and Far Away, fantastic Since I've Been Loving You, with an especially good performance from Plant. He holds that opening note for what seems like an eternity. And then the what I would say is the biggest highlight of the show, a version of No Quarter that is a strong candidate for the all-time best version. Just an absolutely stunning 30-minute masterclass in group improvisation. The chemistry and the jam between Paige, Jones, and Bonham is unbelievable. All of the transitions are really smooth. Jones plays an extended, really nice electric piano interlude before transitioning over to the grand for his solo, which is one of his best piano solos. And then the boogie section on this one is a blues rock jam that's very good. And then, like I say, the solo section proper is just off the charts chemistry between the three of them, with a staggering number of unique jams. It has lots of ebbs and flows with several different ideas and whatnot, and it builds to an absolutely explosive climax. And then the outro section of the song is very powerful as well. And they follow that with perhaps the best version of 10 Years Gone, with Paige playing some pedal steel sounding bends during his solos. And yeah, a very good version of that was not always the most consistently played song this tour, particularly on Paige's part. The acoustic set is maybe the weakest of the LA shows. The show has a very sort of wild party atmosphere, which lends itself really well to some songs and not so well to others. And I don't think it lends itself especially well to the acoustic set, but that is a little bit nitpicky because they don't make any ghastly mistakes or anything. It's just compared to the very high standards set by the acoustic sets of some of the other LA shows, it's not quite as good. And then the Cashmere screw up, which I mentioned, and then in Trampled Underfoot, Paige's guitar cuts out for a lot of the opening verses, which is obviously not their fault, but contributes to the listening experience. And then during Bonham Solo, Keith Moon runs out and starts going on and on about rock and roll, and eggs Bonham on and calls him the best drummer in the world, and tells him to whip Buddy Rich's ass, and then joins in a little bit later in the solo and plays Bonham's kit while Bonham's on the timpani. And then after the song says that he's looking forward to coming back with his backing group later in the year, of course referring to The Who. But that would not come to pass. As it turns out, this was his last appearance on stage in America. Following that, it's Paige's noise solo, which includes a bit of God Save the Queen before the Star Spangled Banner, as I mentioned back towards the beginning of the episode. And that leads into Achilles' Last Stand, which is part of where I is one of the places where I diverge from the popular opinion about this show. A lot of people are big fans of this version, and it's not a bad one by any stretch. Paige plays it really well, and it's very energetic, but I always find it a little bit sloppy, especially from Bonham. He plays it very aggressively, but almost a little bit to a fault at times. At least to my ears, they go just ever so slightly out of sync a few times, and it's certainly, like I say, not a bad version by any stretch, but when you compare it to a couple of the ones surrounding it that are equally energetic and a little bit tighter, it drags it down just a hair. After that, you get one of the best, certainly one of the best later versions of Stairway to Heaven, one of Paige's most emotional solos on it, and Plant sings it very well. Hits a nice high note leading into the solo, which was uncommon on these later versions. And yeah, the solo section is very well played by Paige, and has a very nice build by the three of them. And then in the encores, Keith Moon comes back out and plays with them during rock and roll, and says a little bit before they start the encores, while Plant plays on Bonham's kit, which is cool. So to sum it up, this show is a very fun, energetic one with all four of them really pushing themselves to the limit and playing very aggressively. On some songs that works, on some others it does not work quite as well. And this show, I always kind of characterize it as having extremely high peaks, perhaps the highest peaks, but a tad more valleys than the four shows that I have ahead of it. But anyhow, yes, June 23rd, the third night in Los Angeles, is my pick for the fifth best show of the 1977 tour. Number 4, I have the fifth night in LA, June 26th. This show is an audience recording that is not the greatest, but listenable for sure if you have bootleg ears. Oh, and I should have mentioned the recording for the 23rd show. I said it a bit earlier, but the 21st, 23rd, 25th, and 27th are the 4 Mike Millard recordings, so they're all very good audience recordings. Anyway, so back to the 26th. This one would be neck and neck with the show on the 22nd as the tightest, most technically proficient shows, not only of the LA run, but of the entire tour. This one could very easily be officially released with hardly any editing, I think. There's nary a mistake to be found. They play extremely well all the way through. It has it's almost not worth trying to single out individual songs because they're all just played really technically sound. The No Quarter is the third longest version of all time, 32 and a half minutes, and very good. One of the better piano solos, and perhaps the best transitions from particularly from the boogie section into the guitar solo section proper. Jones plays a gospel-y sounding chord to finish up the boogie section. It's the Paige and Bonham drop out, and Jones does a small little like solo to end it, and finishes on a what must be the tonic, because it has that sense of resolution and really draws that section of the song to a close nicely. And then the guitar solo section is long and very good, awesome interplay between all of them. Very technically impressive playing, and a very good and cohesive build towards a great climax. And then there's a very good 10 Years Gone, one of the better acoustic sets. They play a bit of Elvis's That's Alright Mama. White Summer Black Mountainside is quite long at around 11 minutes, but it's good and goes into a very good Cashmere. This is the only one of the LA shows that doesn't have any variations from the standard set list pre-Encore, apart from the little bit of That's Alright Mama in the acoustic set. And then most of Bonham Solo is cut, unfortunately, but based on how well he's playing the rest of the show, it presumably is a very good version. And then from that, we get one of the best versions of the Noise Solo. I would put it probably top 3 if I were to rank the Noise solos. It's one of the longer ones, second longest at 22 minutes, but very good and very cohesive. You can tell one of the telltales of when Paige was having a good night in 77 is if the Noise Solo sounds focused and flows really well between all of the sections, and this one certainly does. It's one of the few that I would listen to just on its own. Very enjoyable. And that leads into a powerful, and I hate to keep harping on this, but tight Achilles' Last Stand. Following that, they play the third longest version of Stairway to Heaven, behind only the Tempe show on the third leg here in 77 and the last show of their career in Berlin in 1980. But this one is by far the best of those really long versions, and the only one that I would recommend you go listen to. It's over 13 minutes, and Paige plays a fantastic guitar solo, both technically sound and appropriately emotional and interesting from that regard. And the whole band is in sync really well, and building towards the climax. Some Stairway solos kind of peak too early or lose their flow somewhere along the way, but this one has a very nice, steady, and in unison trajectory towards the climax, similar to the one from the second night in Seattle in 75 in that respect. And then this show has my favorite of the encores from the LA shows, the second and final appearance of Jerry Lee Lewis's It'll Be Me in 77. This one's a bit shorter than the Fort Worth one because there's no guest guitarist. So you have Jones on piano, as he did on the Fort Worth one, with Paige, of course, on guitar, and they each take a short solo. And it is a very well played version and a fun end to the show. At number 3, I have the fifth night in New York on June 13th. This one has long been one of my favorites. Unfortunately, it's represented by an audience recording that's a 6 out of 10 at best, but if the sound quality were better, it would surely be widely considered one of the best of the tour. I saw on the Zeppelin forum a few years back, somebody singled out 5 of the shows from the tour as being representative of a different aspect of what made Zeppelin great, and he picked the April 28th Cleveland show for Endurance, which I'm not sure if it's necessarily the best example of that, but whatever. And then the Fort Worth show for Power, which I could see. I mean, you could pick a lot of them for that. And then the the June 21st show for chemistry, the June 26th show for technical proficiency, as I just mentioned ad nauseum, and then this June 13th show he picked for being the best representative of the band's bravado, and I think it's a good choice for that. They definitely play with confidence and swagger the entire night. The opening 1-2 of the song Remains the Same and Sick Again are explosive and powerful, as is Nobody's Fault But Mine. And then they play the second Over the Hills and Far Away of the year, and one of the better 77 versions. In fact, Plant even tries to sing the chorus in the original high melody and just about makes it. And then Paige plays a really good and spaced out guitar solo. After that, they play a extremely good Since I've Been Loving You with Paige soloing incredibly well. After that, we get a no quarter that is a little bit shorter than the other epic ones from June. It's only 27 minutes and change, but it's very good. It has an energetic and very good from a chemistry perspective guitar solo section. And Jones plays a bit of Chim Chim Cheree from Mary Poppins as they're winding out of the guitar solo section and back to the verse, and then a good coda. It has maybe my favorite version of 10 Years Gone after that. Paige solos incredibly well, and it's an overall tight performance of a song that didn't always come off the best live, as I mentioned a while back. And then the acoustic set is very well played and one of the better ones, I would say. Then there's a delay before White Summer, Black Mountainside, because Paige dropped his guitar, which knocked it out of tune. But once he gets it back, he plays a very good reading of it and includes a bit of what was sort of part of Swan Song, which they never ended up releasing, and what became Midnight Moonlight when he was playing with The Firm in the 80s. A few versions from this tour include bits of that, as this one does, and that flows into one of the very best versions of Cashmere, I think. Plant especially gives a very passionate performance, and it's one of the longer ones too. It hits the 10-minute mark, but it's not plodding at all. It just has an extended and thunderous outro. Following Cashmere, we get a very good over the top that unfortunately is cut, but Bonham's playing really well. In the hand section, he does some unique stuff with doing 3 cymbal crashes in a row on the initial parts where he has the snares off and presses down on the head with his left fist and taps with his right hand, and then does a crash. He does 3 crashes in quick succession in that section on this performance, which I find cool, and I used to do sometimes when I was playing Moby Dick with my band. And then after Over the Top, we get the third of the 4 77 versions of Heartbreaker, and it's one of the better ones. Paige plays a very good solo on it, and following that we get perhaps my favorite noise solo. It has I think the most controlled sounds that Paige ever got out of the theremin. It sounds incredibly spooky, like something straight out of a horror movie, but really, really cool. I listen to this noise solo every once in a while on its own. It's that enjoyable. And then it flows into violent and explosive Achilles' Last Stand with Bonham just thrashing away like crazy, and all of them in sync and playing really well. And then Stairway to Heaven, oddly enough, features the only real screw up of the night, where Bonham comes in a verse early after the feeling I get when I look to the west verse instead of the one after. And then so the rest of them adjust course to go along with him. And when Plant gets to the "there's still time to change the road you're on" line, he says, "I hope so, Bonzo." But then they recover for a good second half of the song, and Paige plays a really good solo, and Bonham, you can tell, is eager to make up for his mistake, and accompanies Paige well. And then for the encore, they do the little minute "Whole Lot of Love," but then go into Black Dog instead, which is the first of two 77 versions of it that we have on tape. It's possible, even probable, that it was played a handful of other times earlier in the tour, but this is the first recording of it that we have, and they play it pretty well. At number 2, I have The First Night in Los Angeles, June 21st. This one is one of the most well-known Zeppelin bootlegs, most commonly titled "Listen to This, Eddie," in reference to Eddie Van Halen, who had made some disparaging remarks about Paige's live playing around this time. So the people who titled the bootleg figured that listening to this show might change his mind, and I think it may well have, had he listened to it, because this show is very good. I would say Bonham is the star of the show more so than Paige, which isn't to say that Paige doesn't play phenomenally, because he does, but this would be on the short list of contenders for Bonham's very best show of their career. 2 nights earlier in San Diego, he had a very off night. Plant mentions that at this LA show. He says that they'd like to welcome back to the world John Bonham, who had a terrible fit of food poisoning, and then says he ate far too many rhinestones. So I'm not sure if it was legitimate food poisoning or a bad batch of some illicit substance, but anyhow, after a really off night in San Diego, you can tell that Bonham is really fired up from the start to make up for it, and they're all clearly excited to be back in LA at the Forum, their favorite place after more than 2 years away. But Bonham, even above the rest, is raring to go from the start, and this is one of the best versions of "The Song Remains the Same" ever, primarily because of him. He plays extremely aggressively right from the start, and I would, if I had to pick the single best concert opening by anybody ever, I would probably pick "The Song Remains the Same" from this show. The crowd's pandemonium as the tape starts, with the house lights having gone down, and then the band quickly doing a couple test hits on Bonham's part, and Paige playing a couple notes to do their abbreviated little sound check, and then launching into such a powerful and explosive version never fails to give me goosebumps. And they go from that, of course, straight into the Rover and Sick Again, and Paige notices that the 6th string on the double neck is slightly out of tune during the Rover intro, so then he drops out at the beginning of Sick Again to tune it quickly, which hardly detracts from a very powerful performance of Sick Again. And then Nobody's Fault But Mine is very tight and thunderous, and then they play Over the Hills and Far Away very well with a really good solo from Paige. And when Plant's introducing it, he says it's not even worth telling them what it's about because they would know, the people of Southern California, that is. And following Over the Hills, you get a really good version of Since I've Been Loving You. Now, when I was talking about the show on the 23rd, and I said how the kind of party atmosphere of that show wasn't perfectly suited to the acoustic set, you get a bit of a similar effect here where the overly amped sort of off the wall excitement at being back in LA finally isn't perfectly suited to a sort of slow, somber, emotional blues like this, but there's certainly nothing wrong with this performance from a technical perspective, and it's a good version nonetheless. Following Since I've Been Loving You, we get another of my favorite versions of No Quarter, and one of, if not the most powerful versions. I mean, the verses and choruses and all of that are tight and powerful, and then Jones plays a good piano solo that includes some hints of Your Time Is Gonna Come off of the first album, of course, which is one that they never played live, so it's neat to at least hear a little bit of it. And then the boogie section is good, and but then once they start the guitar solo section, Bonham really takes the lead in a way that I haven't heard him do on any other version of No Quarter, which makes this one really unique and contributes to it sounding so powerful. Usually they're like in sync or all three sort of pulling in equal directions, but this one, Bonham really grabs the reins and takes Paige and Jones along for a ride, and they complement him nicely. The chemistry on this one is off the charts, and it has one of the best and most powerful climaxes where everything just crushes the crowd and cascades and waves. A really cool ending to the jam. And then a violent outro, probably the best outro section of the song that they ever did. Bonham does a ridiculous fill towards the end of the outro that wouldn't necessarily catch your ear as his most impressive to a non-drummer, perhaps, but the way that he how quickly he gets back around from his second floor tom back to the snare and goes around the kit in quick succession, and the syncopation of where he places the bass drum notes in there, take my word for it, it's impressive. And following that is a very good 10 Years Gone, and a very good acoustic set with Plant especially sounding really good. He also gets a good joke in there when Raymond Thomas, Paige's roadie, is tuning his guitar. He says, you have to excuse Raymond, he comes from Scotland and he always tends to tune them in Scottish, which is alright for some. Similar to here he makes a similar joke on the show on the 23rd, I forgot to mention, where he says, you have to excuse Raymond, he comes from Scotland. It's like Alabama, and of course all the Californians laugh. Following the acoustic set, of course, is White Summer Black Mountainside, which Paige plays pretty well, and then it transitions into an explosive and mesmerizing Cashmere, one of the all-time best performances of it. And after that, Bonham has to fix some little thing that's gone wrong with his kit, forcing Plant to give him a very long introduction where he pokes fun at him and all sorts of stuff. It's too long for me to recite here, but if you go listen to the show, which is a good one to listen to because it's perhaps the best audience recording of their career, sound quality wise, and one of the best performance wise. You'll hear it in its full glory. Once Bonham finally gets going with his solo, it's a little bit shorter than some of the other ones. It's only about 15 or 16 minutes, and it's perfectly good, but not one of the more noteworthy ones. I think maybe he was a little thrown off his game with the long delay and having to fix his kit. It's not as good as you would expect it to be on a night that's one of the best shows of his career. I'll put it that way. I think it's maybe a little bit distracted or kind of schizophrenic. I don't know. After that, they play the final version of Heartbreaker in 77, and it's a very good take on it. This guy near the taper had been shouting for Heartbreaker most of the show, so I'm not sure if they did it because of that. But when Paige launches into it, hearing the guy who had been yelling for it squeal in delight is worth the price of admission. Following that, we get a noise solo that is about 17 minutes, as it was really starting to creep up in length by the time we get to the LA shows here. And the crowd gets pretty impatient during it. Somebody near the taper, or it could well have been Millard himself, yells, "We've had the guitar lessons," and someone else yells, "Hey, a-hole, play some music." And when they finally do and transition into Achilles' Last Stand, it's definitely one of the best and most powerful versions of that song. An especially explosive opening to it. Following Achilles, of course, is Stairway to Heaven, and this version features a very good and energetic solo from Paige with predictably over-the-top accompaniment from Bonzo. And then the encore of Whole Lotta Love Rock and Roll is very energetic and a fitting finale to this show, which is definitely one of the best of their career, and very energetic and powerful, and you can tell that they are really happy to be back in LA, which Plant even mentions before Stairway. He says, I'm not sure if you can tell by the atmosphere on stage tonight, but it's kind of a high point of the whole tour to be back here. And after 6 nights, it might not be so easy to say that, but at this point, we'd like to, we give you this song, and then they play Stairway. So that brings us to number 1. At number 1, I have the second night in LA on June 22nd. This show suffers from having, I would say, the second worst recording of the LA shows. I think the 26th recording is worse. But I think if this one had been recorded by Mike Millard, it would be widely regarded as the best of the tour. The recording that it does have is, I think the two main sources are actually the same taper based on the comments of him. It sounds like the same voice and roughly the same sort of equipment for both, but I think he might have moved locations, which results in the latter 2/3 of the show sounding better, and is why no quarter is from a different source, because maybe that's when he moved around. But anyhow, the recording is a little noisy and rough on the ears, but clear enough from The Song Remains the Same through Since I've Been Loving You, and then it switches to a source that is reasonably clear but quite distant and incredibly hissy for No Quarter, and then a terrible recording for 10 Years Gone. And then from the Battle of Evermore through to the end, it's a pretty decent recording. Performance-wise, it's every bit as energetic as the first night, but I would say even tighter and more technically proficient. The song remains the same. Sick Again, opening 1-2 are just about as good as they are on the first night. And then Nobody's Fault But Mine is very good. And then we get the second last performance of In My Time of Dying, and I would say a candidate for best ever version. Very powerful. Plant sings incredibly strong on it. And they even play a little bit of the Lemon song towards the end. Afterwards, Plant says that he lay awake till dawn that morning thinking about lemons and the lack of squeezers, and then says that Paige's pants are falling down. Paige started this show with the black dragon suit, which he wore in 75, and this is one of 2 shows in 77 that he wears it for, the other being the first day in Oakland. And he had gotten even skinnier than he was in 75 by this point, which is why his pants were falling down. He corrects it by putting on a lady's belt, according to Plant, and then switches back to the white during Bonham Solo later in the show. Anyhow, so after that, it's a very good and probably the most raw version of Since I've Been Loving You, of the 6 LA versions, and one of my favorites, really in keeping with the mood of the song and very well played. And actually it has a funny introduction from Plant. He says that it's an English blues or whatever, and that it reeks of left-hand drumming, and then Bonham, I guess, corrects him, and he says, oh, right-hand drumming, which of course is in reference to how a lot of drummers at that point, especially in England, were still using the traditional grip, wherein your left hand would be positioned in an underhand way, and your right hand would be overhand, as opposed to the match grip, which is both hands overhand, which is how I play and how Bonham played and how most drummers now play. But back then the traditional grip was still reasonably common, especially in jazz circles, thought to be to lend itself better to snare rolls and that sort of thing. Anyhow, after Since I've Been Loving You, we get the longest version of No Quarter of their career at 34 minutes. And it's really a shame that the sound quality switches to the inferior source for No Quarter, because not only is it the longest version of all time, but it's one of the best. Jones plays a really cool piano solo, one of my favorites, with some unique patterns that are very in keeping with the mood of the song, which wasn't always the case in 77. And then the boogie section is one of the best and longest, and is sort of an upbeat Chuck Berry style 50s rock jam. And then a nice transition out of that leads us to the very long and good guitar solo section, where that compared to the first night, and especially the third night, not knocking those two at all, keeps a bit more of a flow going, with those ones, especially the third night, ebb and flow a lot and have a bunch of different jams and riffs that kind of rise and fall out of each other. This one keeps a bit more of a steady pulse throughout, and features very inspired and technically impressive playing from all 3 of them. And then the outro section of the song is very good as well. Then it's honestly really hard to make out how good or bad the performance of 10 Years Gone is, because of how poor the sound quality is, but it sounds like it was pretty good, and probably fair to assume that given how well they play the rest of the night. After that, we get one of the best acoustic sets, I think. A very good Battle of Evermore, which when Plant's introducing Bonham coming to the front of the stage to play tambourine beforehand, he says that just last night he was, he says he was who's often found face down on Sunset Boulevard scrutinizing the concrete sidewalk, which I always get a chuckle out of. And then Going to California is a very beautiful version, one of the best I've heard. Unfortunately, somebody near the taper yells, "F all you pigs," pretty loud in the middle of it, which disturbs the atmosphere a bit on the recording we have at least, but has nothing to do with the band's part in it. So A+ for this Going to California for sure. And then a good Black Country Woman, really nice Bron-Rar stomp, extended one because Paige breaks a string and has to pause to restring or whatever during the middle of it. And then a very nice, smooth and cohesive, focused White Summer Black Mountainside into an extremely powerful Cashmere that really captures the desert vibe of the song. Plant sings it extremely well, and it's just a really solid version of it. After that, we get maybe the best over the top of the LA run. It's about 17 minutes, but it's very energetic and focused and powerful with a good flow to it all the way through. Following that, they play Over the Hills and Far Away, which, as I mentioned earlier, makes this the only show in 77 where they played both In My Time of Dying and Over the Hills and Far Away. But this is also the only time, other than the second night in Seattle in 72, which was the first time they ever played Over the Hills, where it appears anywhere other than third, fourth, or fifth in the set list, which gives this one points for uniqueness. And it also happens to be perhaps the all-time best version of it. Sure, Plant sang it better in 72 when he still had his high range, but as far as the instruments go, this is quite possibly Paige's best ever solo on it. Usually he sort of plays a couple runs or whatever, and then takes a pause and then another run and a pause and stuff. It's sort of having a coming up for air effect. But this one, he doesn't come up for air at all. It's just one huge stream of consciousness solo that is very fluid and impressive. So if you're keeping track, we're already at 4 or 5 potential best ever versions of songs. And we get another several in quick succession after Over the Hills. The noise solo is the other of the 3 that I would say are the candidates for best noise solo ever. This one is very focused and has good transitions between the different sections, and each section is played really well. And as I said, when talking about the 26th, that was usually a good indicator in 77 of when Paige was in a good headspace and really on a particular night, if the noise solo was smooth and well executed and everything. And this one certainly is. And then it leads into my all-time favorite version of Achilles' Last Stand. To start with, Paige plays a unique little prologue to the intro that sounds very dark and haunting and in keeping with the vibe of the song. And then once Bonham comes in, they just launch into it at a ridiculous tempo, but it somehow doesn't sound rushed in a bad way. It just sounds unbelievably powerful and explosive and thunderous and whatever other adjective you want to attach to it. I have no idea how they played such a complex and intricate song so fast and so well, but yeah, it's a jaw-dropping version. Paige breaks a string going into the first guitar solo, so Plant, Jones, and Bonham have to improvise for a bar or so until he picks up his Les Paul Deluxe to minimize the amount of time lost in space, sort of, while he's correcting the issue. But I actually like the sound of the deluxe on it a lot for the remainder of the song, and he plays a fantastic solo once he straps on the deluxe, and yeah, it's just a breathtaking version from start to finish, and not only because of the pace. Following Achilles, we get yet another candidate for best ever version with Stairway. Plant has a very nice intro of it too. He says, well, it's been a warm one. Got a few technical problems, but no complaints, and let's hope it gets warmer and warmer and cozy. And then they launch into it, and the first couple verses with the soft section before Bonham comes in are played and sung really well. And then what makes this version really unique is Plant doesn't sing some variation of his "Does Anybody Remember Laughter" ad lib, which always kind of ruins the mood to me just before Bonham comes in. Instead, he sings, and the forest will echo with laughter, 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 and just echoes the word laughter a few times instead, which I think keeps the mood much more intact. So I already give that version a lot of points for that. And then after the fanfare that introduces the guitar solo, on just about every live version, Paige would stay on the 12-string neck of the double neck for an extra bar before launching into the actual solo, which is obviously not what he does on the studio version. But this one, he jumps right into the solo and skips that extra bar on the 12-string, which I always really appreciate about this version as well. And then the solo itself is fantastic as well, and features really good interplay between Paige, Jones, and Bonham. And then the encore is the standard minute of Whole Lotta Love into rock and roll, but is really well played. And yeah, so this show is not only my favorite of 1977, but one of my favorites of their career, and very high on my wish list of shows for the soundboard to make its way into our hands at some point. I think it would be really awesome to hear this show in more detail and clarity like that, to enjoy and to hopefully confirm mine and others' assessment of its quality, and then also to improve its standing in the court of public opinion amongst lead heads. So there you have it. My thoughts and, I'm sorry, long ramblings about Led Zeppelin's 1977 tour of the States. Oh, I should mention that it was supposed to have a few Canadian dates, including Toronto, which would have been the first time here since 71. But then when they had to reschedule it because of Plant's laryngitis, Toronto ended up getting left out, I'm guessing because it was during playoff time, and the Leafs had Maple Leaf Gardens reserved. But anyhow, so that's my thoughts on the 77 tour. It was a little inconsistent, but on the nights that they were really on, and it was a spectacle the likes of which had not been seen before, and you could argue haven't been seen since. It was just a gigantic gargantuan experience to attend one of those shows, and attending one of them, certainly one of the ones near the top of my list, would be high on my places to go list if I ever get a time machine. So thank you all for listening to this episode and to the podcast in general. At the time of this recording, it's sitting at 212 downloads, so really grateful to all of you for helping to get it off the ground, and I hope you're enjoying what you hear and learning something. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Class dismissed.